everyone. You know, those of us gathered around the nation today are often caricatured in the press as a bunch of right-wing zealots who want to oppose any government at all and are working to tear down the government that we have. Those of us that are here know this is untrue. We want to espouse the values trumpeted by Jefferson in the Declaration that all men are created equal, endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And the key part here, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just power from the consent of the governed. Now, those of us gathered here and around America today recognize there's a role for government proper. But we also recognize that the government's forgotten that it derives its just powers from the consent of the people. And any power the government gives to itself without our consent is unjust. We instituted the government. It's our contention that the government takes too much, accounts for too little, and then demands more, often with an arrogance that says, we know better than you. It does this with an aggressiveness that seeks to take away our rights, decide which ones we get to keep, and worse, decide which ones they want to protect. Since we instituted the government, it's my contention, Washington and Augusta, that all of us know better than you. Our forefathers looked to heaven as the author of our freedoms, not to the hallowed halls of centralized government. Our government today has devolved into an oligarchy, the rule by a self-anointed minority comparable to the erroneous assumptions of the 17th century divine right of kings, that our right to property and the fruits of our labor is not a God-given right, but a right given to us by government and controlled by the elite few. Let me submit to you, my friends, that we and those in Augusta and Washington have a fundamental difference of ideology. And I'm tired of paying for an ideology that enslaves me. I question the integrity of a government that compels the payment of a portion of what we earn and then challenges our right to demand an account of what they've taken from us. To this I say, enough. Our government has an ethical duty to ensure the money they collect from us is responsibly spent before they compel any one of us to give any more. They have an ethical duty to see to it that the money they collect from us is used to protect our rights and freedoms, not legislate them away or even redefine what they are. We have a right, indeed a moral mandate, to ask, what have you done with what we've entrusted to you? We have a right, indeed a moral mandate, to withhold from our government that which they've shown they cannot be trusted to responsibly manage. To our elected officials I say this: free citizens created the government, not the other way around. Hence, the fruit of our labor belongs to us, it does not belong to you, and the taxes are what we the people consent to give you. You do not get to decide how much we get to keep. We have entrusted it to you, and we demand an accountability of that trust. We're entitled to it because it is ours. You don't get to ask why we want to know. You don't get to ask why we want it back. Without us, the government collapses into the dust. It's time they get reminded of that. It's the contention of this group and hundreds of others that meet around the nation today. The government has not been responsible with our money. You, government, have stolen the fruits of our labor and hampered our pursuit of liberty and happiness. You have disregarded our God-given rights and substituted them with the rights of the state, as if the state created them. Jefferson said when a government became destructive of the inalienable rights endowed us by our Creator, it was our right to alter or abolish it. And we do this in America with the election process. And we sent a message in 2010, my friends, to legislators everywhere: fiscal responsibility, free markets, and limited government. But apparently they weren't listening. And apparently they didn't get the message. They didn't get the message because there's a disconnect today, friends. Much like the disconnect that existed between Britain and America in the 1700s. Our representatives in government are not 3,000 miles away, but they may as well be. Right. We can go months or even years without hearing from any of them. If our absentee representation does not amount to taxation without representation, I don't know what does. Right. Our elected officials in Washington and Augusta seek to avoid the consequences of their financial mismanagement by passing them on to succeeding generations to whom they're not accountable. We will not stand for this anymore. I will not stand for this anymore. Our forefathers resisted unjust taxation, not for themselves, but for the benefit of their posterity. And so we must do so today, and will continue to do so until our government gets the message. It simply is not right to saddle us, our children, and our grandchildren with debt brought on by irresponsible spending we didn't consent to. And yes, I mean consent. Government is now, and has for some time, borrowed, some would say stolen, the property of those who aren't even old enough to vote yet, aren't even old enough to vote for the consent of the confiscation of their property. Generations not yet born will be spending their money to correct the spending decisions made today. If that isn't taxation without representation, I don't know what is. Our forefathers expressed their opposition to the misappropriation of their earnings to fund graft, to fund favors to chosen constituencies, or fund corruption. There is a point when taxation becomes theft, when it's spent against the wishes of the taxpayer, when it's spent inefficiently, when those who spend it are not accountable for how they spend it. And according to our forefathers, derelict representation served as an argument against unjust taxation. Let me submit the following. When a government spends more than it earns expecting the taxpayer to pay the bill, our representation has become derelict. When a citizen is forced to surrender his property through compulsory taxation and not entitled to accountability from his legislators, our representation has become derelict. When a citizen is told he has no right to question his representatives, our representation has become derelict. The government argues for its irresponsible fiscal management. They're vapid. We've heard them all. The rich aren't paying their fair share. The taxpayer can afford it. There's too many tax loopholes ad nauseum. We're asked to believe that it's a question of honor, that none of us pay enough. We should pay more. This is, of course, intended to create dissension among ourselves. Class warfare, if you will. Turn us on each other. Let me say something I think we all agree with. I'm not interested in how much wealth someone has, so long as they earn it honestly. Everyone's entitled to the money they earn. However, Washington and every state capital are only entitled to the money we consent to send them. Somebody said it earlier, the problem is not insufficient taxation. The problem is too much spending. And those of us who manage our household budgets know that deficits aren't caused by underfunding but overspending. I don't have the luxury of walking out to any one of you and handing off my credit card bill when I charge up more than I can pay. And not a one of you would say you're going to pay it for me, and you shouldn't. Why should our government, which is formed and created by us, have the ability to raise our taxes or pass the bill to our posterity when it spends more than we send it? Now, this problem crosses party lines. Very few legislators are immune. I think we all know that. It always makes me chuckle when Washington lectures American business or American citizens on ethical behavior. Yes, there's been unethical and illegal activity in corporate America. Behavior I categorically denounce. Yes, there are a few wealthy individuals who exploit the poor. Behavior I categorically denounce. But let me say this. The most corrupt, unethical, greedy organization in the United States is not on Wall Street or in our communities. It's in Washington, D.C. And your behavior, Washington, we categorically denounce. There was an arrogance in the British Parliament in the years leading up to the War for Independence. It's eerily similar to what we see today. The Stamp Act 1765 implied that the colonists were obligated to pay whatever taxes were passed by the Parliament because, as Parliament said, they succeeded and they thrived because the government nourished them. Citizens were seen as property, subjects to serve at the pleasure of the government. In the Declaratory Act of 1766, the British Parliament asserted complete authority over the colonists to the point of overruling their provincial assemblies and magistrates. The Townshend Act of 1767 was passed by Parliament taxing products the colonists could only purchase from Great Britain. Now, don't we see that attitude existing today? Does not Washington demonstrate this arrogance when it tells us how we should live? When its federal courts set aside legislation passed in our states or by citizen initiative? Wisconsin and California, most recently, to name just a couple, or when they mandate that we purchase products like national health care. Washington says, who are you to question us? Washington's subtle encroachment on our liberties is meant to desensitize the American people, so they willingly accept government-imposed dependence through oppressive taxation. You know, the British tried this too, but our forefathers were a little smarter than that. And they knew we can't be free, we can't be happy if our property can be taken without our consent. To be free, men must be secure in their property. The Founding Fathers knew this didn't only mean land. It was defined as everything that a man possessed: his faculties, his ability, his right to conscience, his right to self-determination, his right to earn a living, to keep all that those possessions provided for him and his family, to use them as they saw fit in their pursuit of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. You know, government wants us to think that they're the apex of that pursuit, that we're here to serve the almighty state. Once we yield to that ideology and forget that we are uniquely created by God with inalienable rights, we will cease to be free. And once the government has the authority to deprive us of the fruit of our labor, he will deprive us of his rights. Now, to the argument that we elected people to government as our representatives in Washington or in Augusta, and hence we consented to the legislation that they passed and their legislative triumphs and, confiscating our wealth, let me say this: legal doesn't mean right, legal doesn't mean ethical, and legislative theft is still theft.
Yeah, that's right.
Now, I reached that conclusion by measuring their legislation against a higher standard of ethics than the moral relativism that permeates the halls of the government here in Augusta and in Washington. Now, let me ask Washington and Augusta something. Let me ask them, or give them a chance to be accountable. Can you say this about our tax dollars? That none has been lost to graft or earmarks to buy votes. And we used to call those bribes. None has been lost to fraud, shady contracting, inflated bids, favorable treatment to campaign donors. None has been lost to redundancy or funding for those programs and services that we no longer need, services that are best left to the private sector or they're not wanted. Because the government unions that represent the workers in these programs will withdraw the support or throw the tantrums that we've seen in the building behind me for the last 3 months. None has been lost to financial mismanagement, funding lavish perks, poor management, or inefficient or incompetent disbursement. If the answer is no, and we all know that it is, then they have no moral authority to compel us to give them 1 penny more. It's immoral, it's theft. We're having none of it anymore. Our posterity will judge us by the resolve we exhibit in the face of the crisis that we face today. We have a moral mandate to leave them a nation in better shape than we found it. We will not give up. This is not about power or political allegiances. It is not a political question. It is a moral question.
That's right.
We are submitting to our values, and they transcend party politics. The cause is right. It is just. We have long memories and are teaching the purpose and righteousness of our cause to those that we influence. We are here today to tell you this, and get this message. We are watching, we are keeping an account, and we will remember on Election Day. Ignore us at your peril. If you cannot be trusted to protect our inalienable rights, we will replace you with someone who will. That's our moral pledge, so help us God. Thank you. God bless America.